Sarah grabbed the beeping pager, grateful that her 3 young daughters were asleep. She had barely scooped it up when his disgusting, guttural threats resumed. There was no on-off switch or recorder like with an answering machine. The person paging just started to talk, and the receiver had no choice but to listen. Sarah listened for just a second, then she stuffed the pager under a throw pillow to muffle the sneering voice. The phrases "cut you up," "dismember," and "carve your eyes out" were his usual fare. She didn't listen for any new taunts. Sarah was required to carry the beeper for work. A newly promoted manager, she had to be available 24/7, and she was not willing to risk this job she had worked so hard for, not even if it meant she had to endure being tormented day and night by an unknown stalker. She knew by his words that he was skulking around, so she started keeping the curtains and blinds shut. More than fear, she felt guilt. It wasn't fair to her kids. They had all moved 6 months earlier to the desert of Nevada, and they deserved to enjoy the warm air and sunshine. But Sarah feared for their safety more than her own, so she was edgy and hyper like a chihuahua. Things had quickly fallen into place in Nevada. They moved in briefly with a family friend. Then Sarah found an entry-level position at a remote gas station. She rented a cute little house, and she and her 3 girls settled into a comfortable new routine. Then Sherry disappeared. Her co-worker, Cheryl Daniels, was an instant friend. They clicked like sisters from Sarah's first day. She enjoyed watching her new friend blossom in a budding romance with a mysterious boyfriend, Andrew Ireland. It was a cool name, like one of those guys in her favorite Harlequin romance novels, back in the days when she had time for such guilty pleasures. Andrew always picked Sherry up from work for their dates, but she explained he was a little shy and didn't introduce him to her co-workers. One night, though, after the pair had been dating a few months, Sarah caught a distant glimpse of Andrew Ireland. He did not look like a Harlequin hero. He was all right looking, if maybe a little nerdy in his black-rimmed glasses and helmet hair, but Sherry really liked him, and that's all that mattered. Sarah pretended not to notice him staring at her as she wiped the large glass window. After a few more dates, Sherry tearfully confessed that it was over. Andrew was married. She stormed out of the gas station in an understandably foul mood. Sarah started after her, but thought better of it. Sherry just needed some time to work it out by herself. Sarah would never see Sherry again. In fact, no one would. Cut to gas station 6 months later. Robert Generoso pulled into the lot and caught Sarah as she was heading inside. Robert was a regular. She was pretty sure by this point there was nothing really wrong with his truck. He came to see her, and she was secretly flattered. Unlike Sherry's boyfriend, Robert was very handsome. He could score the cover of a romance novel. But he was sweet and unassuming, not cocky like she'd labeled him when she sized him up at their initial meeting. Sarah was barely 20, and Robert was a little older. How much older she couldn't tell. He was also relentless. Over the past few weeks, he'd asked her out at least a half-dozen times. She kind of liked it. After 3 kids, it was fun and exciting to be pursued like that, and it took her mind off missing Sherry. He asked again. She thought it over. What did she have to lose? She had a ready, reliable babysitter, and she hadn't been out on an actual date in forever. Robert was clearly surprised when she accepted. He quickly recovered and promised to call soon. He had a definite pep to his step as he returned to the truck and drove off. A few minutes later, there was a call for Sarah. It was Robert, asking her out to dinner that night. Again, she said sure, her mind wandering to where they might go. Then he added, "I've been looking forward to this for a long time." It was a completely appropriate sentence, but something about his tone didn't quite sit right. After they ended the call with Robert offering to pick her up at her house, Sarah felt like she had snakes under her skin. Robert had unnerved her somehow, and she decided to bag the date. She couldn't officially cancel, though. She had no way to reach him. So she figured she would just stay at work a few extra hours and apologize the next time she saw him. It was the following day. Sarah and another young female coworker were in the office when a raging Robert drove his fist into the glass wall of the store. He was furious, with the wild eyes and snarl of a rabid dog. Her friend reached for the phone, but Sarah begged her off. The terrified girl crouched behind the counter as Sarah tried to apologize and defuse the situation. Her calm voice and apology about working late only enraged him further. He was screaming, ranting, and raging like a maniac, repeating over and over that she was a whore. He finally tossed a handful of cash at her and sneered, "I went to a lot of trouble and you ruined everything." He raced back to his car and peeled out of the lot. Sarah was surprised to find her hands and knees trembling. She knew she had not seen the last of Robert Generoso. Later that night, she lay in her bed, replaying the ordeal over in her mind. How could she have been so wrong about him? And what was it in that phone call setting up the date that had made her feel so dirty? She closed her eyes and eventually drifted off. A short time later, the pager beeped from the nightstand. She was totally out of it, panicked to think she was late for work. It was him. The other one. Her original scary psycho. Instinctively, she held the beeper away from her ear, waiting to hear his plans to carve her up. Instead, she was treated to the anguished screams of a woman. It sounded like she was being tortured. Sarah flung the beeper across the room. The next day at work, she noticed something that hadn't really caught her attention before. A post-it behind the register. It had her name and beeper number on it. Anyone could easily have seen it from the other side of the counter. Maybe it was time after all to bring the situation to someone's attention. But who? The police probably wouldn't do anything, and she didn't want to be a problem for her bosses. She was still a new hire proving herself. She needed to get back to work. She walked outside to pump gas for a customer. She gave him his change and was returning the hose to the gas pump when Robert pulled in. The customer nodded and drove off. It was the night shift, and Sarah was alone. Robert revved the engine. She could see the smirk on his face and knew she was in big trouble. She dropped the pump to the ground and sprinted back to the shop. His massive truck was right on her heels as she dove through the open doorway. He had literally missed her by inches. It was definitely time to call the authorities. Before Sarah could even figure out who to call or what to say, the phone rang. It was her mother, phoning from Bullhead, Arizona. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police had just called her, looking for Sarah. They had linked her to a homicide. Sarah tried to calm her mother, but she needed to get off the phone. She promised to explain everything soon and hung up. The phone rang again. The voice on the other end of the line identified himself as Sergeant Brady from the Metro PD. He insisted Sarah was in grave danger and needed to lock herself in the store. She was totally confused. He and his partner would be there soon, but she needed to stay out of sight and secure the doors until they arrived. They got there quickly. Sarah had just enough time to warn the babysitter to lock all her doors and keep the girls inside. The detectives explained that Sarah needed to come to the precinct right away. They forced her to lay in the back seat of the patrol car, which was in the shop, concealed from view. She did as instructed and was ushered to an interview room at the police station. There, Sarah was presented with a thick album of mugshots. Before she could open the book, they started filling in the missing pieces of this twisted puzzle. Police had just found the body of her friend, Sherry Daniels, in a place called Hellhole Canyon, Utah. She had been tortured and shot in the head. Her battered body was then dumped in the desert. The remains were not mummified. Sherry's body was in sufficient condition to be autopsied. But Sherry had disappeared 6 months ago. Where had she been all this time? Was it her screaming Sarah heard through her beeper? Turns out it probably was. Brady explained they had found Sarah's name and contact information on a scrap of paper in the dead girl's wallet. He opened the mugshot book and instructed Sarah to look at the photos to see if anyone looked familiar. She paged past a blonde male suspect who looked high, as well as a Hispanic man who looked to be about 40. Brady asked if she knew the man. Sarah's mind was jumbled. Which man? Brady repeated the question. After a few seconds, Sarah understood. Oh my God, it was one man. This bulging book contained photos of a single suspect. He was a chameleon, she learned. He took names from headstones to adopt as aliases. He used makeup, wigs, glasses, and other accessories to disguise his appearance. She was mindlessly flipping pages, then she saw him. It was Robert Generoso. her regular customer turned suitor who tried to run her down. Sarah identified Robert to the detectives. Over the next few hours, they explained that in addition to Sarah's name located at the scene, they also found a credit card dropped near the body. It belonged to Stephen Peter Morin. Morin was born in Providence, Rhode Island in February 1951, making him 30 when Sarah first met him as Robert. He was a career criminal. He dropped out of high school and became a drug addict. At 15, he was arrested in Florida for stealing a car and served 2 years in jail. Over the next decade, he was in and out of prison in various states for crimes ranging from resisting arrest to drug possession. In September 1976, he made the FBI's most wanted list for the abduction, rape, and torture of a 14-year-old girl. While on the run, he moved to Las Vegas and married a woman named Sylvia. He was using an amalgam of the names Sarah knew him by, this time Robert Ireland. He was always 2 steps ahead of the police. As Sarah struggled to process the information, Sergeant Brady warned that she was in imminent danger. She needed to leave the area immediately and hide herself and her children so Stephen Morin couldn't find her. Morin knew where she worked and where she lived. Sarah believed they would be safe at her mother's. She would return to her house first to pack for the trip. There was no other option. After dropping off the kids with the babysitter, Sarah had a friend drive her home. The tension was palpable. Her friend Sally led the way to the darkened house. Sally backed up when she saw the front door was open about 4 inches. He was in there. She heard rustling and breathing from inside. They raced to the car, certain he was behind them. After nervously fumbling with the keys, they sped out of the driveway. They returned with the police, who conducted a thorough search of the home. There was a chair propped behind the front door, along with Sarah's rifled address book. They determined he'd fled out the back after she and Sally drove off. Now he had access to everyone close to her. Where could she possibly hide at this point? She was certain he would find and kill her, but she was determined to protect her loved ones. Sarah and the girls stayed with her mom. Then he found her. He dropped a dime to promise he would always know where she was. At that point, they moved in with Sarah's aunt and uncle in Texas City. Sarah thought it should take him a while to track her down there. In December 1981, Sarah was startled by the ring of the phone at her aunt's house. Had he found her again? Her hand trembled as she listened. It was the police. They had finally arrested Stephen Peter Morin at a bus station in San Antonio, Texas. He was the subject of an FBI manhunt, wanted in Texas for the murder of a young woman named Carrie Marie Scott. She had confronted him trying to steal her car, and he killed her. Investigators were certain that the serial killer had ultimately traveled to Texas to murder Sarah. He was obsessed with finding her and torturing her in the ways he had teased during all those pager calls. Once they had him in custody, investigators pieced together a timeline. Just before his capture, they raided a hotel room where Morin had been holed up with a female accomplice. There they rescued 23-year-old Pamela Jackson, who had been held captive by the pair for weeks. That was this serial killer's mark. He kept his victims for weeks, even months, before finally killing them. Sarah Clark, the accomplice, was captured, but the elusive Chameleon escaped again. He then abducted a 14-year-old girl and held her captive in his car. She recited passages from the Bible and convinced him to let her go in Austin. He then decided he would head to Fort Worth to request a meeting with televangelist Kenneth Copeland. Thankfully, before he could get there, he was apprehended at the bus station, ending the Chameleon's reign of terror. Stephen Peter Morin eventually confessed to 4 counts of murder. He was suspected of more than 40 killings overall, including 7 men. However, there was insufficient evidence to try him for those crimes. But he was tried and convicted in Texas for the murders of Carrie Scott and Jana Bruce. Colorado convicted him for the murder of Sheila Whalen, and he was scheduled for sentencing in Utah for the murder of Sarah's friend, Cheryl Daniels. That matter was retracted when Morin was sentenced to death in the Texas homicides. While serving his time on death row, the killer claimed to have found God. His lawyer believed the conversion was real, as did the other inmates who participated in Morin's jailhouse Bible classes. In the end, though, that really doesn't give much comfort. So many of his victims never saw the justice they deserved. On March 13, 1985, 34-year-old Stephen Peter Morin was executed by lethal injection. Because of his weakened veins from years of drug abuse, it took 40 minutes to put him down. His final words were a prayer, thanking God for his favor and asking forgiveness for his executioners. It is shocking that such a prolific, vile serial killer, whose victims certainly rival in number those of Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy, is virtually unknown. It is probable that, like Bundy, his good looks and charm worked to disarm his victims, helping him to remain hidden in the shadows for decades. It took time, but eventually Sarah Pisan and her girls recovered from their ordeal. Sarah, now in her early 50s, lives in Oregon. In 2013, she published a book detailing her experience titled Sarah's Story, Target of a Serial Killer. Her ordeal was also featured in a 2014 episode of the TV docuseries Obsession: Dark Desires.